Since its initial release in 2004, Marauding Captain has appeared in the artworks of over 20 Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and that's pretty uncommon for a card that's not technically part of any archetype. Even more uncommon is that not only is Marauding Captain appearing in those artworks, but there's actually an overarching storyline with Marauding Captain and a ton of other monster cards from Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Now, in today's video, I'm not going to focus so much on that storyline, although you certainly are open to go read that storyline if you want to. There are many different people that have posted about it, but in today's video I want to talk about, in terms of competitive play, what the top 5 cards with Marauding Captain in the artwork actually are, because Marauding Captain has been in the artwork of good cards and bad cards and some really good cards and some really bad cards, but in today's video I only want to focus on those really good cards. And I think that what's interesting is that what you'll notice when you look at these cards is that many of these cards, much like Marauding Captain itself, have appeared in a variety of formats. And I do want to mention, I'm not going to technically put Marauding Captain the card on this list, but Marauding Captain is a good card and has seen play. I mean, when it first came out, it was known for the Marauding Captain lock. When you have 2 copies of Marauding Captain, your opponent just can't attack, and that was pretty good for 2004, 2005 Yu-Gi-Oh! When we think of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Marauding Captain very recently saw tons of play in Goki decks. Not only was it a warrior monster to make Isolde with, but it also was a level 3 monster, so you could make MX Saber Invoker. I know that Marauding Captain isn't seeing as much play now that Goki's recently got hit on the ban list sort of indirectly, but I think that it is important to note that Marauding Captain was seeing a ton of play before MX Saber Invoker got banned. Anyway, at number 5 we have Memory of an Adversary, a card that is a little strange, and a lot of people might have actually not heard of this card. It actually very recently came out in Duel Links, but it's not quite as good in Duel Links, but it did see play in 2014, and for an interesting reason. So this card has, it's not like quite like Dimensional Prison, but it's like a Dimensional Prison plus Change of Heart. So when an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can take damage equal to the attacking monster's attack, and if you do, banish that monster. During the end phase of your opponent's next turn, special summon that monster to your side of the field. So obviously an extremely slow effect. This is not a very good tempo card. However, it is a very valuable card in particular formats, especially when they're slower like they were in 2014. So the main reason that this card was being played back then was to prevent your opponent from blowing up your entire board with fire and ice hands. So Memory of the Adversary not only removed them from play like a card like Dimensional Prison would have done, but also it meant in a couple turns of waiting you got to have that monster on your side of the field that you then could use for rank 4 material, and that was pretty good. And it didn't see sort of widespread play. It only really saw play in Geargia and Hat decks. However, those decks were extremely popular, and in those decks it was very, very good in the mirror match, and also it is in some ways pretty good monster removal for cards that can't be destroyed or targeted, because this card does not destroy or target them. And in some cases you would actually just kill your opponent before you ever got a chance to have their monster, and that was pretty good as well. Obviously this card doesn't see nearly as much play anymore because the game has gotten so much faster, but in 2014 in that Hat format, this card was a pretty good tech option. At number 4 we have the Warrior Returning Alive. Target 1 warrior type monster in your graveyard, add that target to your hand. A pretty simplistic card, and a card that really hasn't seen play for a long time. However, this card did see play in a variety of formats, and there are a couple reasons for that. It's a pretty good way to recycle cards, and even though it doesn't special summon them like Monster Reborn or Soul Charge, you have to put this card in the context of how old it is. And back in the day, recursion wasn't as plentiful as it is right now. Yes, you did have Monster Reborn, and yes, you did have Premature Burial, but the Warrior Returning Alive could add anything back to your hand. And what's really cool about this card is that unlike a lot of cards, unlike one of the cards that's going to make this list, this doesn't actually have a level requirement or an attack requirement or a defense requirement. As long as the monster is a warrior type monster, you can just add it back to your hand immediately. Now, will this card ever see play? I'm not so sure. Probably not anymore. Nowadays, people care more about special summoning cards than just adding them back to their hand, but I wouldn't say it's that far-fetched if this card did end up seeing play in some sort of warrior deck, possibly one with a lot of effects that special summon themselves from your hand, so that in some way it kind of is like a Monster Reborn. But until a card or until a deck like that sort of comes out in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, this card probably won't see play for a while, which is why it's not not much higher on the list than number 4. But this card did see a lot of play, and it is a pretty good option for a variety of older school Yu-Gi-Oh decks that are based on warrior monsters. In general, the advantages of a quick play spell card versus a normal spell card or a trap card is that it can be both. It can be a card that when you go first, you can set it and respond to your opponent's plays, and it can also be a card that when you go second, you don't have to wait around to activate. This is true for our number 3 spot, My Body as a Shield, a card that is extremely versatile and actually sort of ahead of its time. I mean, don't get me wrong, this card was played a little bit when it came out. It was a pretty good counter to things like Regeki and Dark Hole and Mirror Force and Sakuratsu Armor, but with My Body as a Shield, it seems like it only gets better with time. Now, this card can't stop every effect, but when your opponent activates a spell, trap card, or monster effect that would destroy a monster or monsters on the field, pay 1500 life points, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. So even though it can't negate every effect out there, it's not as versatile as Solemn Judgment or Solemn Scolding, this card can be played immediately from your hand when you go second, which happened to be extremely powerful in 2017. I mean, that's really recent when we, in the grand scheme of things in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, 2017 Zodiac format, this card saw a ton of play, and that's really exciting. Not only was this card a staple 2 of, it sometimes saw play as a 3 of, and sometimes it was in side decks. It was one of the most popular cards of 2017 Zodiac format, mainly because it was a perfect counter to Zodiac Trident, not only when you went first and you could use it to stop their Trident popping your cards, but also when you went second. I mean, if you guys didn't play back in 2017, I know that wasn't that long ago, but maybe you took a break during that format because it was all just Zodiacs. One of the biggest troubles for many decks, Zodiacs included, but also just any rogue deck going second, every single time you were playing the game, every single turn, you just had to assume that there was a Zodiac Trident on the board. Therefore, cards like My Body as a Shield became extremely popular, because if you always know that there's a card that can trigger My Body as a Shield, well then My Body as a Shield is going to be a very popular and powerful card, which many players saw and actually took advantage of. But also, there's a couple of other cool applications for this. For example, you could use this to stop a Ghost Ogre, because Ghost Ogre destroys a monsters on the field, and that's a sort of unique application that not every single old school card has, but I think in the case of My Body as a Shield, we just see it getting better and better as time progresses. Anytime there's a format with a quick effect that destroys cards, My Body as a Shield is probably going to be a very popular side deck or main deck pick, depending on how popular that destruction card is. At the number 2 spot, we have a more recent card, Dimensional Barrier. Now, this came out just a couple years ago, and it says declare 1 monster card type, and it has to be either Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, Exceed, or Pendulum. For the rest of this turn, either player can special summon monsters of the declared type, also negate the effects of all monsters of that type while they're on the field. You can only activate 1 Dimensional Barrier per turn. So this card, just for the record, you can't call links. Even though that it says 1 card type, this card has been printed after links came out. It's been reprinted with the current text. You cannot call links with this. I'll just get that out there. But even with that in mind, this card still sees play. And the reason it sees play is that there are some decks that, even though they have link monsters, they still rely on one of those mechanics heavily. For example, this card is an excellent counter to the Thunder Dragon deck because they can't summon either Titan or Colossus. And even though they play more link monsters than they do fusion monsters, their fusion monsters are the main sort of ending boards that they want to use, so Dimensional Barrier is an excellent counter to them. For example, another deck would be like Invoked, a deck that does play a lot of link monsters, especially if they're playing the Mech Knights. However, their fusion monsters are like the main monsters that they want to end on, so Dimensional Barrier is very good. And just in general, this card has seen a ton of play. I mean, it saw play in Zodiac format. It was good going first or second. It saw play right when it came out in ABCs, not only for rogue matchups, but also you could call fusion against ABCs, and just like in the case of Thunder Dragons and Invoked, it basically just says skip your turn. I think the existence of Dimensional Barrier, kind of like My Body as a Shield, really means that anytime that there's a deck that's in the metagame that's going to use one of those mechanics really heavily, Dimensional Barrier is going to be a popular choice. I mean, just think about it. It's hard to say, but I think if Dimensional Barrier was out when Necroz were at their full power, Dimensional Barrier probably would have countered them a lot harder than many of the other cards out there at that time. But because this card didn't exist, Necroz just sort of reigned free. But I think if we sort of put Necroz in the context of 2018, even if they're at full power, I don't know how good they would be just because Dimensional Barrier exists. So this card is a very cool sort of stun card. There aren't a lot of good trap cards that are coming out in the last couple years. I mean, there are a couple really good ones like Dimensional Barrier, like Solemn Strike, and like Infinite Impermanence. But as I've talked about in many videos, and as you've probably seen in deck profiles, a lot of people just aren't playing trap cards anymore. However, Dimensional Barrier is one of the trap cards that is still seeing play even in this extremely fast 2018 Yu-Gi-Oh!, which means that it must be pretty darn good, and in fact, it is. The number one spot on this list can go to none other than Reinforcement of the Army, which interestingly was also released in 2004 in the exact same pack that Marauding Captain was in, basically starting out the trend of Marauding Captain appearing in other cards' artworks. But Reinforcement of the Army is no joke. I mean, this card has basically seen play in every single format in some deck, either in the meta or in a rogue strategy, since its conception. It's way too good at 3 copies per deck. It's even still pretty good at 2 copies per deck, but even at 1 copy per deck, it is seen play in decks. And the big reason that Reinforcement of the Army sees play is that anytime, even if there's only 1 copy in your deck, if you have a 3 of warrior monster, Reinforcement of the Army acts as the 4th copy, and that really does boost consistency over the course of a long tournament. Not to mention, if you have a deck with many different warrior monsters, Reinforcement of the Army boosts the consistency for all of them, and that's really powerful. And if you're really wondering, is Reinforcement of the Army too good or too broken, it might not be broken in and of itself, but just keep in mind that in all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, Konami has never printed another card like Reinforcement of the Army for any of the other types. Sure, we have archetype cards that maybe on paper are better than Reinforcement of the Army. A card like Sky Striker Engage is obviously just a Pot of Greed on steroids. A combination of Pot of Greed and Reinforcement of the Army seems pretty crazy. However, keep in mind that over all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, archetypes will always come and go. I mean, yesterday's meta deck is always today's rogue deck. I've made a video about that, and that matters. In the case of Reinforcement of the Army, and in the case of cards like Allure of Darkness, you have to keep in mind the reason that they haven't printed more versions of those cards is that even though archetypes come and go, so you can print sort of crazy archetype searchers, in general, I mean, types and attributes will never leave. Those things are always going to be present. So anytime Konami prints a level 4 or lower warrior monster, they have to keep Reinforcement of the Army in mind. And it's probably not good enough to ever be banned. All it does is boost your consistency and give you some more versatility. However, it is a card that will pretty much always be played as long as there are warrior monsters worth searching, which for the foreseeable future seems like there always will be. So this card has to be number 1. It's a card that's been played more than any other card on this list and is likely one of the most played cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, even though at first glance it might look pretty unassuming. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video. I had a lot of fun making it. If you want to learn more about that Marauding Captain sort of story and the lore behind the card and why he keeps appearing in all his artworks, feel free to go look it up. There is sort of an interesting backstory there. I'm not really a Yu-Gi-Oh history as far as lore goes channel, so I'm not really going to talk about that. But if you are interested in that, feel free to go look it up. It is pretty cool. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video though. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you later. Goodbye.